Hello, everyone. My name is Cole William Whitlaw Gibson. Welcome to the A24 on the Rocks podcast. Tonight we will be indulging in End of the Tour, starring Jesse Eisenberg and Jason Segel. Tonight I am drinking a whiskey ginger with some bullet bourbon and with a side of some cold brew coffee. Up next we got Kevin.
Good evening, world. This is Kevin K-Con Kononjek, and tonight I am drinking a Downtown Toodaloo, which is a rock and rye from a distillery in La Crosse called La Crosse Distilling Company, and mixed with some apple cider, because it's fall, and it's delicious. So, Kelly, you're next.
That sounds great. As mentioned, this is Kelly, and in contrast, I'm just drinking a glass of red wine. Not even worth giving it a name, because it's just some cheap red wine. Eric?
I will give it a name. It's called The Punishment by 19 Crimes, and it's a Pinot Noir!
Hey, that's a pretty good wine.
Yeah, that's a pretty popular wine. Come
and
on,
I'm Eric.
What do I know?
Thank you, Eric. A24 on the rocks. Yeah, 2015, the end of the tour. It's the story of a 5-day interview between Rolling Stone reporter David Lipsky and the acclaimed novelist David Foster Wallace, and it took place right after David Foster Wallace published his 1996 groundbreaking epic novel, Infinite Jest. Let's start with Eric. What were, I guess, your initial vibes and thoughts on this film when you go in with the intro and how
So I knew of David Foster Wallace. I've tried to read Infinite Jest, and it is over 1,000 pages. It's very hard to read. I've read his collection of short stories called Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, which was also made into a movie, and I liked that a lot. So I can't call myself like a super fan of him or anything. So going into it, though, I was aware of him and kind of his significance as a writer. And I knew he killed himself. And the movie starts out with his suicide and David Lipsky, the journalist, kind of going back through all these tapes and seeing if he saw any signs that he might do this. And I totally got that feeling, like David Lipsky, he was like, no, well, he literally said, no way he killed himself, And then when he went back through these tapes, you start to see him, like, even when he just starts playing some of the tapes, that he would kind of realize, like, oh, maybe he would. And, yeah, that was the opening vibe of the movie for me. It was very melancholy, for sure.
Yeah. What about you, Kelly? What is your knowledge and history of Mr. David Foster Wallace?
Yeah, melancholy was the initial vibe. David Foster Wallace I wasn't familiar with at all. I even asked Eric, will it matter that I haven't read his books or really know much about him? And Eric told me no. So I found that was the case. I think that you learn about him throughout that, and it really made me want to read Infinite Jest watching this movie or anything else by him. Now I'm super curious about him as a person. So hopefully they gave him an accurate depiction of who he was as a person. I'm sure that they did. But the feelings of this movie were something that I haven't seen captured in another movie. The kind of relationship between the two Davids was very interesting, and I enjoyed the way that the tension came and went, and they were on, they were off, and the moodiness that they aren't afraid to explore out of both of these men, I appreciated right from the get-go.
So I don't know if it's wrong place, wrong time, ignorance of famous authors or literature, but I went into this movie completely blind as to what I was going to start watching, in the sense that I didn't read that this was based on true events. I didn't know the name David Foster Wallace when it was pronounced. So I watched this movie as a complete work of fiction. I watched it as something that was created by a writer and something that was kind of put onto the screen. And watching it that way is got to be a completely different experience, I feel like, than probably you guys had from maybe knowing what you're going into, at least a little bit. in that first realization when I found out that it kind of was all crashing at me at once, it was like, holy shit, like all of these things that I watched, all these emotions. And several times in my notes, I even write, is this dialogue real? It's like, is this something that sounds like real could happen between two people? And, it turns out that that's exactly what it was based off of. So that for me was very, eye-opening and awesome. And I know we're going to talk about it and break it down. But that initial watch through, it was kind of very melancholy. And I knew I was watching an A24 film, so I knew there was something a little bit different about it and something that I didn't need to take at face value, that there was something deeper down that I was supposed to take away from the film. And at the end of it, I definitely felt that. And then the realization that it was all based on a true person is just kind of still kind of reeling a little bit, to be honest, because while watching it, you don't get that impression, but you kind of do at the same time. And then when you realize it, it just kind of all makes sense. So that's my initial impression, was just shock and awe and wow and cool and all of those things.
And if I could just say something, we were all born in like the late 80s to early to mid 90s. So the pinnacle of David Foster Wallace's fame, was 96. So we are a little bit outside that generation that would have, kind of known him as a household name.
Yeah, so Kevin, I was in the same boat as you, man. I finished this movie probably 15 minutes before we got on and started this podcast. I did not look up anything about this movie. I didn't even know what it was about. I just pulled it up and started watching it, and it was quite the ride. And I'm not by any means a literary person. I like to read, but I've never heard of David Foster Wallace. I have heard of his post-mortem book, Pale King, but I wasn't aware of him as a person or anything like that. So I kind of came into this blind and was taken on quite the ride, I will say. One thing I thought that was, a lot of movies do it, but I always find it interesting, is it always, it starts the film off basically with the call of, David Foster Wallace has killed himself through the eyes of the other David, the Rolling Stone, David Lipsky. And I'm curious as to what your guys' takes on, do you think that this kind of story, or the way that this is told, that you needed to know that, the suicide happened, or this would have been just as good if it was, you were told at the end of the story, at the end of the interview? We'll go back to you, Eric, on this one.
I think that this film can exist outside of knowing any background about the author and any background about David Foster Wallace or David Lipsky. I do think that this tells a concrete story that, you could go into it not even knowing it's a true story, and it can still be a riveting film to you, I think. And like Kelly was saying earlier, the relationship between two writers, one a journalist, one a very acclaimed fiction writer, that's a very interesting relationship to explore, and especially the one of a journalist interviewing another writer. I just found that very fascinating to explore. And so, yeah, I don't think you really needed to know anything about these people before you went into it to enjoy this film.
So I think it's poignant to talk about the decision to let the viewer know right away that David Foster Wallace has killed himself. So now we're in the film itself, and now from a viewer's standpoint, I think it's actually critical that you get that, because that makes, for better or for worse, our character more interesting, right? It makes it more of a tortured soul, someone that has something more going on. And if you know that right off the bat, the whole movie that you're going to watch is now viewed through that lens of, okay, why did he kill himself? We have to find those things out. We have to look through his lens, and that the movie wouldn't be the same at all if we didn't have that lead off. And I don't think that this story kind of exists, obviously, without that tragic ending. And unfortunately, that does play into the actual plot of this film. But yeah, I think it's absolutely necessary for it to move forward.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Kevin, because I think such a big part of understanding David Foster Wallace's, I want to say his character, even though he's a real human being, but to understand him as we get more and more interviews and close to him, as how it ends, so you already know that there is this kind of depression that's underlying. And I think many people are like, well, you're the most famous writer in the world, what's your depression come from? And it's this great take on what it's like to be depressed, when it doesn't mean just you can't get out of bed. It still means you can go on tour, it still means you can talk to people, but I think it explores that psyche in a way that I haven't seen a movie really do, where it is, as he describes later in the movie, he calls it a spiritual crisis and expectations that will never come to pass, and just trying to live with that. And I think at some point too, he says, like, you're just trying not to let that part of you drive. And I think that that's such a great perspective on it, that knowing that from the beginning makes you more aware of who is talking to you at the time, rather than it just being a surprise at the end or something, because it's a masking that I feel like we already have a bit of the mask lifted off because they introduced it in that way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Kelly. I took special note of that moment when he's talking about the depression and not letting it drive, and how it kind of relates very true to some things that I deal with in my life, but I'm sure plenty of people who deal with mental illness and depression deal with as well. It's that battle of not letting those things take control of you, and how do you manage them. And if you look into David Foster Wallace's life and his entire battle with it, from an early life all the way through when he lost his battle, he had a constant struggle with medication and deciding what worked for him and what didn't, and that's where the substances played in, and just all of those things. And he eventually maybe did let it drive, or for better or for worse, but I just think it's, like you said, a poignant moment that makes us all kind of have that emotional reaction, and I did appreciate the film for it.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with all of you guys, and I think this is one of a very unique film from my perspective in the way that they handle like mental illness and explore the depression and explore, this real person, and how it affected him to the point where obviously he took his own life. And I'm curious if any of you guys, I was trying to think of, in the Slow West, we talked about all these other Westerns that we had seen, and I was curious if any of you guys knew of any other films that, explored this kind of, this theme and this item. And really the only one that I could think of was one that's actually stars Jason Segel as well, or Segel. And it was, I think it's Jeff Who Lives at Home. I haven't seen it in a long time, but it's a pretty good film. Kind of dives into the same stuff. But I was just curious if any of you guys knew of any films or anything that dove into those themes. Feel free to jump in if anyone has anything.
First one that comes to my mind is Little Miss Sunshine, and that has Steve Carell as a depressed individual who tries to kill himself, and how he reintegrates himself into his family, and it showed a really kind of real picture of what that looks like, how you still have the support of your family, but you still have to kind of work your way through what you're still dealing with while still trying to be a good supportive member of a structured family house. So that's one that comes to mind.
Some of my favorite films about writers, I guess, Capote with Philip Seymour Hoffman, that was a great one. Another one, Adaptation, which is about Charlie Kaufman, the screenwriter. It's kind of a fictional version of him trying to write a screenplay. Those are two films about writers that I really loved, but I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this, where you have a journalist that is a writer interviewing another writer. I don't think I've ever seen a movie quite like this that has explored that way of, somebody who just created something very monumental.
I think movies that gave me a similar vibe, that aren't necessarily about writers or the culture or depression or anything like that, but give me a similar vibe, are also movies that have... Is Jason Segel, is he like a comedy actor typically? Would we call him that?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a coincidence that these other two movies I'm going to name are the same thing. One is Everything Must Go with Will Ferrell, where he plays a more serious role, and has been divorced. That one gives me a similar vibe, and it's been a long time since I've seen that movie. And the other one is Punch Drunk Love, which is a masterpiece of a film, but it gives me a similar internal feeling, all three of these movies, of this, like, I don't know, get out of my head kind of way, where I really appreciate it about all three of them, and I can't even pinpoint exactly why it is that I feel that they're all kind of related and are in the same universe in a way. But if that makes any sense, that's what I'm feeling about similar movies with this kind of vibe and feeling.
Jason Segel became, I guess, famous because of How I Met Your Mother, which is highly comedic and not at all what we're talking about, but just as an aside.
Yeah, I think you're forgetting Sarah Marshall and some other ones. He definitely has the comedy side of him.
And it also fits
but everything
A24 picking up A-list actors in projects because they exist as A-list actors.
So speaking of Jason and Jesse Eisenberg, when they first meet each other, so in this movie, Jesse Eisenberg is the Rolling Stone journalist, and he travels out to meet with other David, who is played by Jason, and he's David Foster Wallace, and they drive up, and the initial awkwardness I thought they captured very well. I actually apparently the very first time that they actually ever met each other was purposeful, to the point that they put it in the film, where they have never met each other until they see each other in the film in real life. So I thought they kind of brought that to life very well. It was very creative, touched by the director. But I'm curious as to what you guys' thoughts were on both of those actors in their performances in this film, both Jason and Jesse. We'll go to Eric.
So my thing with Jesse Eisenberg is he kind of always just plays a version of himself as someone, and he definitely did this in here. I looked at an interview with David Lipsky, and he is not really anything. Jesse Eisenberg doesn't really portray him like him. It was the same with Mark Zuckerberg in The Social Network when Jesse Eisenberg played him, but he got by with that one, in my opinion, because like the kind of pithy, sarcastic guy, I could totally see that embodying a tech CEO, you know. And then Jason Segel, he doesn't really change his mannerisms as much to be like David Foster Wallace. But I think the thing with Jason Segel is he physically embodies, I think, David Foster Wallace pretty well. They're both kind of bigger guys. When they put the hair on him and the bandana, I was transported into not just seeing Jason Segel on the screen, but seeing David Foster Wallace. I also, in my, I was an English writing major in school. He gave a big graduation speech called This Is Water, which is like got viral on YouTube. And I just remember him in his bandana, and he definitely embodies David Foster Wallace, and I think Jason Segel did a very good job in this. Jesse Eisenberg, I think, kind of passes for me. I think he portrays the emotion well of his character, but he is, again, just kind of playing himself as somebody else.
Eric basically said exactly what I was going to say. Jesse Eisenberg is always Jesse Eisenberg, but Jason Segel I only knew from Freaks and Geeks, and he wasn't anything the same. I completely lost him in this character, so I think that he did a phenomenal job.
I will say, not knowing that this was based on real life people, like, he did a good job of portraying what the character probably, and like you said, came out to be in real life. So I could picture that being a real person in the way that he acted and how that attributed to some of the things that he was dealing with in his personality and his mannerisms. So I thought it was an excellent job done by him. Even the moments where he got, you could feel when he was excited, or you could feel when he was sad or tired. Like, he really had a great body motion to him, not as well as just his voice, but the way he held himself, and just overall just an excellent performance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, I did not know that this was based off of a real life or anything like that. I reiterate the same sentiment. I'm glad that everyone thinks that Jesse Eisenberg just plays Jesse Eisenberg, because he drives me crazy. And like, I like a lot of his movies, but he drives me crazy. And then when I find out that this movie is based off of, real life people, they're using the real names, and it's about, all these tapes and everything like that. And then I'm like, well, Jesse Eisenberg he just showed up and is reading the script, and is just Jesse Eisenberg reading the script. So that kind of bothered me some more, but Jason definitely pulled off the look and the mannerisms for sure. One thing that was I think they did a very good job in this film, and seemed pretty important, was a lot of the music and the sounds, and a lot of the songs that they utilized in this film. And they pull a lot from like REM, which I think is a very good band and artist. And Kevin, you're one of our more prolific musician people on this podcast. What is your initial take or thoughts on this film?
I think that the background soundtrack fit all of our moods appropriately. I think that when we had the high moments and the low moments, it kind of felt that it went along with it. Although in a movie that is super heavy in dialogue, where it's 99% dialogue, I pay almost no attention to the soundtrack, if that makes sense. Like, I'm digesting the words, I'm looking at the scenes, and I'm not necessarily taking in what I'm hearing in the background as much. So for me, the soundtrack wasn't good nor bad, more like it existed perfectly in the sense that it moved the movie forward, and I didn't have to take note for it being good or bad.
Beginning and ending of the movie. I agree with Kevin where it's so dialogue heavy that in the middle of it, I was like, wait, I should probably be thinking about sound. When is it happening? And anytime I actively thought that, there was no sound or no score, which I very much enjoyed because it's a real life conversation many of the times. But the beginning and end of this movie has a certain soundtrack that I was going, it's giving Nightmare Before Christmas. And it's Danny Elfman. I was like, it was giving Nightmare Before Christmas. It was giving Pee Wee Herman, and it's probably the only composer that I could call out other than like a super famous one, but not that he isn't. But he's got a very unique style, and he definitely brought that into this movie. I think it's an interesting choice. I think it was a little upbeat and a little fun for what the movie is. I think that the movie definitely has its funny parts, but it'd have a different vibe if it was more like strings and like heavy orchestra or something like really like heavy. So the lightness was an interesting choice, and I like that they sandwiched the movie within the sounds.
So I have to say that comes as a complete surprise to me that Danny Elfman is associated with this film. Like, that doesn't make sense to me at all. That's weird to me. It just doesn't make sense.
He's known for the Tim Burton films, but like, so he also composed scores for Men in Black, Spider-Man 2, 50 Shades of Grey, Justice League,
and none of these about a famous tortured artist from the 90s.
Yeah,
like
Good Will Hunting.
Yeah, and then Good Will Hunting. I mean, he's done a lot. He definitely can turn on his Tim Burtonness and turn it off whenever he wants, I think.
But just it begs the question: why was it necessary? Why does is this film a tribute film? Does this film exist because you want to really pay tribute to a great mind like David Foster Wallace, or does it exist for some other nefarious reasons, perhaps?
I mean, maybe he jumped on it though. Are you talking about why does the whole film exist, or why did Danny Elfman join? Okay,
right. Yeah. So why does the movie exist, and then B, why to get a big name like Danny Elfman associated with a movie that maybe this feels more indie and not necessarily big budget or needs to get a lot of eyes on it. But
when David Foster Wallace killed himself, there was like people knew he was a depressed guy, but this film I think is a unique, foray into what he actually might have been thinking. And towards the end, we do get a heavy amount of why he was depressed earlier in life, and you could definitely tell that that might have been something that came back to him later in life. And also, after Infinite Jest, David Foster Wallace did not publish a whole other full-length book and until Pale Cane came out after his death. And you could definitely tell in this movie he had a lot of imposter syndrome. He was worried about becoming that like ex-author that hadn't published something in a while, showing up at publication parties like he even says in here, like, there's David Foster Wallace sticking his head in the back of another photo. All these things in here, I think, definitely paint a picture of why he might have killed himself, and I would like to think that David Lipsky wrote a book on this, and this movie was made as kind of an interesting look into depression and why somebody with that kind of fame and notability might, decide to commit suicide. And then Danny Elfman, I don't know if he was friends with David Foster Wallace or not, but I'm sure that he enjoyed David Foster Wallace and was like, I want to be on this picture and provide a score for this that would appropriately depict everything that's in this script.
I will take off my tinfoil hat for the moment, but I do reserve my right, mostly because of some of the controversies that do surround this film, and I'll let Cole take back over, but that's kind of my thought.
I always love when other people host and I can just sit back and relax. But no, I think when David Lipsky wrote the book and eventually developed this film, I don't think it was to make money or to get fame or anything like that, because it just seems like, at least from the film side, the care and the way that they handled it and the portrayal of the David Foster Wallace and their relationship, I felt like it didn't seem like a cash grab. Although tinfoil hat, every movie's a cash grab in one way or
Kevin,
another, so.
you're smirking over there, so hit us with what you read about this movie then.
Yeah, come on, Kevin.
Hold on. Look, the simple fact is that the estate of David Foster Wallace came out in protest of this film. And the simple fact in my mind is that David Foster Wallace would have laughed the person out of the room if they would have said, hey, we're going to make a movie about your life. It goes against everything that he stood for as a person, as an author, this idea of becoming famous and all of the materialistic things that go behind it. I think the movie touches on all of those themes, and if you would ask him if he was being alive, if he would have wanted something like this, without knowing anything about this guy before yesterday when I watched this movie, I don't think he would have wanted this movie made, and I think his family didn't want it either. But legally, they couldn't do anything about it, and that was kind of the part that allows it to continue. Minus that, I don't really have any real reason to believe that David Lipsky is a shyster or any other reason. He does make his friend look to be a literary genius and someone who should be well regarded. So for that, he should be applauded. I just wonder sometimes if the conveniency of writing a book and releasing a movie and all of that, just let the guy rest.
I think, this could go back into what we were talking about with Amy. When you are an author, a musician, a writer, and you've worked your whole life to release something that people, you want to make money off your art. That's what you do, and in a way, you were born with this massive talent, and you're put on this earth, with this massive talent. Are you just not gonna, show that to anybody and never make money off your art? Like, I think some people might be fine with that, but I definitely think David Foster Wallace and a lot of other people, they will seek that out, and then when they get all that fame, they don't want it anymore.
I think so. I think also a quote in the movie that I'm gonna not quote directly, but spoke to me a lot, was when they're at the Mall of America, which was a hilarious choice. And David Foster Wallace is saying it this whole time, being a writer and not getting any fame or publicity for it, you convince yourself that it's because anything that's really good is actually quite terrible. But then you become what's famous and considered good. And now, are you terrible? And how do you deal with that whole situation? I liked that very much, and I feel like, so I'm a graphic designer, but I went to school thinking I'm going to be an artist, right? But that's a long payout of not having any money for a long time when you could just start with money. I think that had I gone the artist route, I would have maybe the exact same kind of mindset, and it would be this trapped feeling of I never actually want to be famous, but I do need to make money, but I do need recognition. But if I get too much, that's a problem too. And I just think that scene is a really good, like, self-reflective moment and almost kind of tongue-in-cheek for even telling the story in film at all.
And then one more thing too, he does have a quote towards the end. One of the reasons he was put on suicide watch, what he was thinking, it wasn't a chemical imbalance, it wasn't drugs and alcohol, it was much more than that. I had lived an incredibly American notion of life that if I could just achieve X and Y and Z, everything would be okay. So he was definitely put on suicide watch, I think, because he thought he was a failure. He had a existential dread inside of him that he was a failure and was going to be a failure.
Right. I think so many artists and so many people who write and create look for validation of their work through the people that consume their media. I think that those people, regardless if they say they want it or not, they want people to enjoy what they're writing. They want people to enjoy what they're putting down. And when you're already suffering with imposter syndrome, when you're already suffering with this anxiety, I mean, we get it right away from the beginning when he talks about he doesn't want to hurt people's feelings, and he's so concerned about what people will think about him, and he's just this sensitive individual who worries about his interaction with, he'd rather be around his dogs than a human. And that's very evident, and that's probably how the real life David Foster Wallace was. So it was just an accurate portrayal of all of that.
Yeah. I want to actually put that quote out into the ethos. He says, "It's so much easier having dogs. You don't get laid, but you also don't get the feeling you're hurting their feelings all the time. I emphasize, strictly platonic relationship with the dogs."
That's an excellent quote. I'm glad we threw that out there. Ethos, you're welcome.
This film has a lot of really, really good quotes and a lot of things that spoke to me in a lot of different situations from, in the way that David Foster Wallace whether it was a direct quote or through the tapes, but the way he's able to express his feelings of anxiety and the imposter syndrome and kind of opening up throughout this film. I don't know. I think I think it does a very good job of putting these feelings that a lot of people deal with, but maybe not everyone understands, and puts them, gives them like kind of a harder context throughout the film that I thoroughly enjoyed. And one of the best quotes that I thought in this movie was his correlation of VR porn will lead to the death of all of us. Mm-hmm. So, my question to you all is VR porn going to destroy all or the fabric of society once it becomes readily available to all of us?
It'll destroy all men. Not to interrupt.
It's a shame that we don't have Blaze with us to talk about sex robots like we did at Ex Machina, because that would have been too easy. So, of course, I have to be the one to feel it.
Always already has the vacuum, too. So.
Right. And we haven't discussed it for our listeners that Blaze is fighting a hurricane at the moment. I know he won't be when you hear this.
That's why he's out, yep.
Yeah.
With his bare hands.
With his bare hands. He's got the American flag. He's out in the middle of his porch in Tampa fighting this hurricane. Yeah. Anyway, sex robots taking over the world, no, but I do think the idea of VR and self-stimulation is going to be absolutely real life. I think, what movie is it? Idiocracy, maybe? Or the one where you basically just have all of the screens in your face constantly, and it's right in your face. It's everything. And
go away, biting.
Yeah. Yeah, go away, biting. Yeah, I think that's going to be reality. So, yes, the answer is yes.
And yeah, that quote, I have it right here too. Because the technology is just going to get better and better, and it's going to get easier and easier and more convenient and more pleasurable to be alone with images on a screen, given to us by people who do not love us but want our money, which is fine in low doses, but if that's the basic main staple of your diet, you're going to die. In a meaningful way, you're going to die. And I agree with him. I think we were talking about the Ex Machina episode, is that we are all getting more isolated, and you do have these kind of incels on the internet where there are a lot of lonely people that just sit in their house and they don't have a lot of meaningful social interactions every day. I mean, they're not really happy people. So, and I think that is what VR porn and just that kind of internet universe is creating, for sure.
I think what was so cool about his quote right there is it was similar to Andy Warhol and David Bowie. All three of these men have made great predictions about a future that they don't live in. Andy Warhol says in the future everyone will be famous for 5 minutes. That's happening. David Bowie says what the internet is going to do to society is unimaginable. That's also happening. And this VR porn, this is a guy who passed away a little bit later, saw a little bit more of what the internet was already doing. I think that he's going to be right on the money as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and with the COVID happening and everyone being, we all had that period of isolation, and the internet, became our connection, and then you saw the, OnlyFans has exploded since then, and all of that is basically, paid pornography via, to make you feel like you're attached or close to someone, but in reality, like the exact quote was, you're paying for that person's time or to give them you a service, which is fine. And, I support anyone who wants to do OnlyFans and all that stuff, but it definitely seems to have had a possible negative effect on society, and it just keeps growing and growing. And who knows where it's going to lead or what's going to happen to, society as a whole.
It seems so ominous. We just started with the question about sex robots, and then it's just the downfall of man.
That's what we did in the other episode as well. We started with vacuums, and we ended with...
and
everything.
Yeah, he was very much a futurist, David Foster Wallace. I think Infinite Jest has a lot of that theme to it, too. He's a bit of a futurist, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, shoot, I just trying to read or look up a summary or the plot of Infinite Jest was just even that
all over
my head, trying to even figure out what the book is about. And I'm I couldn't imagine reading a 1,000-page
he's known for a lot of very long, technically they're not run-on sentences, but he's known for extremely, extremely long sentences and just like stream of consciousness writing. And somewhere in there you can find a plot, but it takes a lot of attention to be able to find that, and that's kind of what he's known for. And it is true, though, he kind of created a whole new way of writing, and he definitely threw the writing world on its head. And that's, when Infinite Jest came out, and in this movie we see, the critical praise for it.
So I will plug a random podcast that I found while doing research for this one. It's called Jest Friends, and it's a group of individuals that break down Infinite Jest 50 pages at a time and record 20 episodes of it and dissect it and go through it. So if anyone really wants to know about Infinite Jest without really reading it, go ahead and look up Jest Friends on your local podcast network. I didn't listen to it, but I know it exists, and I am relatively interested, but I know I'm never going to digest it, so I'm just going to leave it as something cool that I learned today. New trivia.
God bless. That's such a cool idea. The thing that I was reading about Infinite Jest, because watching this movie made me so curious about it, was that it's like a pillar of postmodern books. Like if you want to know about postmodernism in the book world, this is one that you just must read. And hearing Eric describe that it's just run-on sentences a lot, and it just completely just takes everything that was given to us and breaks it down and builds it anew. That's cool. I know about that in the art world, but I don't know about it so much in the book world. My curiosity has grown even more. I'm glad to hear about this podcast so I can have my own book club.
Literature has always reflected art and history.
Yep, and we'll continue to do so as long as it exists.
So, moving into the throughout the movie, the relationship between the two Davids is quite an interesting one, and quite, I always talk about how I like the slice of life and the slice of life movies, and more of the low stakes, just people being people. And this whole film is basically about those two's relationship throughout this film. And I'm interested to hear what your guys' takes were on if it was a realistic portrayal of two people. And I know, Eric, you've talked a lot about the journalist and the author, and I'm curious, how do you feel like this was portrayed throughout the film?
I really enjoyed that they kind of did portray both of them as just normal people. David Lipsky went into meeting David Foster Wallace thinking he would have this monumental personality, he had this idea that he'd be this famous person, but really he was just a normal guy living in the middle of Illinois with his two dogs. He likes junk food. He can't have a TV because he's addicted to television, and he has a lot of just he literally says at the end, "I treasure my regular guyness," and he is kind of just a regular guy. And I love how that this film kind of breaks down the mythos of the writer, which is also something David Foster Wallace talks about. When he talks about he doesn't drink anymore. When he was heavily drinking, it wasn't, the mythos of the writer. It was an anesthesia for him. And that relationship between the two of them, I enjoyed how we kind of saw just, they had fragile male egos. That was definitely one thing. And they just seemed like just very normal people. And yeah, definitely that scene where David Foster Wallace kind of snaps at David Lipsky for, talking to his ex-girlfriend in the kitchen, that you could tell he has jealousy. If you read more into David Foster Wallace, he seemed like an obsessive boyfriend to his partners. So you could tell this was kind of a film that was breaking down the mythos of the writer too. And you could see that in the relationship, and I really enjoyed that.
Something that I really liked about their relationship right at the start, too, was it seemed like David Foster Wallace, when they first go to the diner together, he just wants to get to know the guy who's interviewing him and have a conversation with him. And Dave Lipsky is working, and there's so much focus from the camera on when that recorder turns on and off. Mm-hmm. And I love that they made that a thing, because when it's on, you almost see Jason Segel, you see the anxiety turn on, or you see it maybe amp up. And I like how very open he is about that too. I loved how that's how their relationship started, and by the end it was, let's have McDonald's together. I'll take you somewhere nice.
Yeah, I alluded to it earlier in the episode, but at one point, I'm looking at my notes, and it literally just says, "Does it feel like real conversation?" And that's before I realized or found out that it was based off real conversation. So that means that they did a very good job of creating dialogue. Now, granted, they probably had tapes with actual conversations that they were able to base a lot of these things off of. So, but it's still credit to them for the way they made it come across. A movie that's damn near 2 hours where it's just two people talking has the risk of losing its audience. This one didn't do that. This one made the conversations compelling. It made me want to actually listen to what each brilliant mind was saying to each other. And I say that because they're both authors. They both have been down that road, and the dichotomy of David wanting to be David, right? That idea that he wanted everything that David Foster Wallace was. He wanted the book tour. He wanted the fame. He wanted all of those things. And for me, looking at it from a work of fiction, I thought it was a movie about jealousy and about an author wanting to compete with a fellow author and how that can ruin a friendship. And it turns out that it was based off of real life, which is just even more compelling and interesting to me. I really liked that piece. I really liked their focus on that, even though it was subtle. It was still a plot device that really made each character kind of sing, because we don't get that line at the end, right, when David Foster Wallace says, "You don't want to be me," or "You should reconsider," or how you want to, like, "You don't want to be me." Just leave it at that, and that's the last thing we hear from him. It's kind of an interesting take, because the whole movie, all the first David wants to do, Jesse Eisenberg, is be David Foster Wallace. At the end, he's like, "Don't do it," and now we kind of see why.
You know, we've been doing this podcast for almost 45 minutes. And, you know, typically in an A24 film or on this podcast, we talk a lot about, you know, the cinematography and the set design and all these things. But, you know, we haven't even touched on any of that, because this whole film is dialogue, and it's so heavy dialogue, but they do it so well that, you know, like you said, Kelly, you dive into it to the point where you don't even realize that if there's a song played or anything like that. Was there anything in this film in terms of the set design or the cinematography or anything that stood out to you guys while watching this, or was it just all the dialogue and the story and how it was written? Kelly, I'll go to you first.
I noticed that David Foster Wallace's bookcases were made of cinder blocks and plywood, and I thought that was an awesome choice. I think that his whole house was well made and well set up, and I like that we have David Lipsky then run around with his recording device right near the end of the movie, just taking note of everything that he sees. So I thought that was well designed. Everything was intentionally placed to look like it was unintentionally placed, and they did a great job with that. The other thing that I already mentioned was when they turned the recording device on and off. I think that was well done as well, and I think that they had a great mixture of medium and close shots when we needed to feel closer to the words and when we needed to understand that they are in a world having this conversation. So I think that it was well balanced, well done. The only part that really stood out as like extremely artistic to me might be when they're walking the property near the end of the film on the snow, and he's describing what it looks like in the spring, and that's like a nice wide landscape shot. That one kind of stood out, as well as the parking garage situation where they lose the car for a while was also kind of just beautifully shot in a very just like average guyness kind of way. So cinematography, I think it isn't over the top, but it doesn't need to be, and I think that they did a good job with it.
So before I lose this shot, or before I lose this thought, I really enjoyed that scene too, Kelly, the one where they were looking for the car, mostly because it was silent. You know, there's so much of this movie they're talking and talking and talking, and now we get this fight or this feud where they don't speak to each other for an extended period of time, and it's just the slow walk and the awkward clicker, and it just was brilliantly shot. It made you feel something. The tension kind of built, and it was just well done. Yeah.
There is one thing about set design that I'm surprised Cole hasn't pointed out yet. The modern fast food signage. They did not take it back to the 90s with the fast food signage. I don't care enough about that to really knock the film for it, but yeah, like, okay, I'm okay with it not being over the top. I think, you know, okay, in the end, I'm going to say that this film didn't absolutely blow me away. You know, it wasn't something I came out of with like, wow, I just went through a huge experience or anything. I just thought it was a very solid, good film in terms of the directing, cinematography, and set design. That's okay. It won't take it up to a very high, very very high grade for me, but I'm just I was happy watching it at the same time.
I think it did a very good job of making me feel that we were in the Midwest. I think that from the book tour, the way the landscaping was with the snow, the over-the-top quintessential, oh, hi, how are you, chaperone lady from Minnesota. That was really good.
John Cusack's sister.
I really enjoyed the whole setup that made me feel the Midwest at home. And as a Midwesterner, it was very accurate, and they did a very good job of that. So the attention to detail was right on. And using places like the Mall of America, we talked about how that felt light and brought some levity to the whole feeling of the movie, and that was pretty cool. So in general, I think they did a good job. Kelly, you touched on the wide scene at the end there with the snow shot. Thought that was very excellent, and it was just kind of like we're walking to clear the air, literally to be out in the air, to clear it between the two of us, and to move the movie to a resolution. So I thought those were all excellent choices by our writing team and director.
This was
Good
shot
call
in
on
Michigan,
the-
too. Shot in
I was
Michigan.
just about to say.
Yeah,
Yeah,
good call on the
obviously
Midwest.
beautiful.
Everything.
Yeah.
They even ask for Pepsis, I think, at the diner, and the waiter walks away, says one thing. He's just like, "All right, 2 pops." It's like,
I did catch that. Yeah, I was like,
Mhm. I guess this is kind of a credit to how well or how much I enjoyed the dialogue and dove into it. Is Eric pointed out, I didn't even notice, all of the flaws in this movie in terms of the set design and pieces, as I've done in lots of other films where I pick them apart. I did not notice any of it because I was just enthralled and wanted to know what was next going to come out of, David Foster Wallace's mouth. I didn't dive into it, so I don't know if it was on purpose or not, but I really enjoyed that they set it in the winter months where it was cold. Obviously it's in the Midwest, there's snow, it's cold, it's miserable, and I felt like that set design and that feeling of them scraping the windshields and walking and through the snow and it being cold really kind of melded well with the emotions and what it was trying to describe throughout this film. And one of the best scenes was at the very end where Jesse Eisenberg is walking to his car to leave, and it's just silence, and all you hear is just him walking through that snow that has that like squeaky tone to it as he takes every single step. And if you're not from the Midwest and you don't have that like slightly wet, heavy kind of snow and you don't quite understand, they nailed that to a T, and it just brought me all the way back to Michigan. Fuck, I haven't walked through that stuff in years, being stuck down here in Georgia, but it made me miss it. I'm not gonna lie, it made me miss it. Does anyone have anything else or any other questions before we get to our closing arguments and our final decree of this film?
I want to shout out to Alanis Morissette. Bologna sandwich.
Yeah.
Just you can't imagine, like these women in a magazine like putting a quarter in a parking meter or eating a bologna sandwich. But her, I don't know. I just find her absolutely riveting, and I love the Alanis Morissette angle of the film.
yeah, I believe that was pretty awesome. I agree with you.
Yeah.
One line I also took away that I think our listeners should kind of think about is he's when they're describing, I don't know if he's describing himself, but he says he's pleasantly unpleasant. And there was just something about that I kind of took away as there are people in our lives that we could definitely describe as pleasantly unpleasant. And it's just a unique way to look at it. And I thought that described the character that Jason Segel was trying to portray pretty well. And I just thought it was unique and a good takeaway.
those girls who were fans, or one was a fan and the other was the ex-girlfriend slash previous colleague, they totally were just waiting for the guys to invite them up to their room at the hotel. And I like that they play that because previously in their conversations, David Foster Wallace is like, I just want them to tell me. Yeah, like, I'm not gonna ask because I don't know if he says it like this, but he's like, I'm not a whore, basically, is what he's trying to say. And I love that, like, the subtext is so, like, it's screaming at us and it's just under the surface and it's like, guys, come on.
Yeah.
And neither of them are gonna do it.
There was definitely an odd sexual tension whenever, the two girls were in screen and It was just like, okay, at the scene where David Foster Wallace kind of flips out at David Lipsky. David Lipsky was definitely being flirtatious with that girl. It didn't warrant David Foster Wallace freaking out at him, though. Like, I don't think David Lipsky was gonna carry that to anything more than it was. The odd sexual tension the whole time, you could feel it for sure.
I have two more scenes I just thought of going back to cinematography because they involve the girls as well. When they go see that movie together, and David Foster Wallace is enthralled in this guy's movie, and the girls look half asleep, and David Lipsky is just staring at David Foster Wallace, just staring and observing him, and we have this kind of cool further away shot of that happening. And then when they go back to, I think it's the fan's house, or it might be the colleague's house, the same kind of scenario is showing up after he gets scolded, after he's like, okay, fine, I'm gonna have a beer because I got yelled at.
Yeah.
They come back, one girl's asleep, one's gone. David Foster Wallace, again, enthralled in the TV, completely leaned in at a 45-degree angle. David Lipsky leaning back in his chair, beer in hand, just staring at him, not the TV. Yeah. And I'm like, that's two really, really good shots that I would be doing a discredit if I didn't make mention of.
Yeah, those were. And, I mean, I would be doing a discredit if I didn't shout out Broken Arrow. If you haven't seen that movie, what a weird, wild ride. Yeah. And it was so nice to see that actually.
I just saw John Travolta getting a missile to the stomach and getting blasted through it.
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah, so good.
But I do think it's such a great tell on what David Foster Wallace had used the television for as a distraction from what could have been depression, from his genius, his whatever it was. TV was that escape, and so much to the point where he had to take it away from himself because he knew it was such a crutch and such an addiction. It just really spoke to his character and what they were kind of trying to achieve with getting that across.
Yeah, and one thing that I did want to mention, or one thing that I thought was very interesting after I did a little bit of digging after I finished this film, was, the whole entire time David Foster Wallace, he has a ton of anxiety. He talks about how, you could write this article 90 different ways, and there's really only one way that I would like you to write it, essentially. I don't want you to portray me as a dick. We all know that you can spin the narrative or spin anything to fit what you want. And I was interested to, I guess, find out that David Lipsky never wrote that Rolling Stone article about him. He got back and he got focused on working on some other things, and he never wrote the article, never wrote anything until he wrote that book about David Foster Wallace. And I thought that was very interesting.
I'm glad you answered that question for me, because that's what the movie left me as my big question that I wrote on my sticky note right here. What happened with the article, and did it go out? I assume that it did, and I wanted to hear his thoughts on it because they would have had each other's contact information. So they kind of left. I wish that they made mention, because I was a layman coming into this. I don't know the story between these two men. I wish that they just kind of said he moved on to something else, or they just showed him kind of just set it aside or something like that. I'm glad you answered that question because the movie did not.
Right, it kind of made it seem like he forgot about the tapes in the closet and that was the end of it, so I assumed that he didn't write it, but you're right, they were very unclear about it at all.
I feel like Rolling Stone would be pissed. It's like he just spent all this money, spent all this time in Illinois. It's shot in Michigan, but placed in Illinois.
Well, remember, he didn't get anything really salacious, right? He never says that he's on heroin. He doesn't really get anything good, so he probably takes it back to his publisher and is like, meh,
I think
not
you
worth
could
it.
write that last quote about him not doing heroin. I felt like was a really interesting quote. I felt he could.
Well, I agree, but the movie made it very clear.
Profile on him,
right? But the movie made it clear that he was focused on trying to get salacious stuff. Right? When that phone call, he wants him to ask about the heroin, and he's forcing him into that situation. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. We'll have to ask.
Which is Rolling Stone in a way,
You're right.
They kind of want the salacious stuff,
He's not working at Rolling Stone by the end of the timeline, start of the movie, right? He's working somewhere else at that time, I think.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it I mean what it said, or basically the reason why he didn't write the article was, one, it wasn't as salacious. It didn't talk about the heroin. But that Rolling Stone, when he got back, Shannon Hoon, Hoon, died of a drug overdose basically shortly after he got back, and Rolling Stone wanted him to focus on writing that because it's more salacious than an author that was addicted to television, essentially, right? So,
right.
which, I guess good or bad, but we did get the book out of it in this film. So, with that being said, let's move into our A24 on the Rocks official world premiere ratings of End of the Tour, starring Jason Segel and Jesse Eisenberg. And I want Kevin K. Konachek to start us off.
All right. So, as I've shared a lot of my viewpoints throughout the evening on the highs of this movie, some of, not necessarily the lows, but some of kind of the middle parts as well, I've shared my idea that going into it blind kind of made me appreciate it a lot more for what it was. When I initially left the movie, I think, Eric, you kind of mentioned it earlier, that you weren't really necessarily like moved by it, right? It wasn't something that you got changed by. It wasn't something that was a big moment of your life finishing the movie. It was a good movie while I watched it. I didn't get distracted by my phone or want to do something else, and that's usually a good hallmark of a film. I think the actors involved were very, were good. They're not exactly excellent. We touched on that earlier, on the idea that Eisenberg tends to be himself, but I thought Jason Segel did a pretty good job, and it kept my entertainment throughout the whole thing. I enjoyed the set. I enjoyed the way that they paced the film. I thought that they did a good job of creating a realistic portrait of what turned out to be a real-life person, and that's very important. If the film, not knowing that it's based on true events, can make you believe that it's based on true events, then they did a good job. They did something that, as a viewer, goes ahead and pulls the veil of disbelief away, and it kind of shows you a real-life portrait, and that's, a hallmark of something excellent. I did enjoy it pretty much from start to finish. I would recommend it for my friends, mostly for the literary audience and for someone who's looking for just kind of a unique film. I do appreciate A24 for kind of looking at this film from a different light. But it doesn't, it wasn't great. It wasn't fantastic. It doesn't really do a whole lot more for me other than a B24. So we'll kind of leave it at that. B24 down the middle. And I'm interested to read more about David Foster Wallace moving forward because of this film. And they did a good job of kind of sparking that interest in me as well. So kudos to them.
I have a list. I have loves and dislikes. Hates, perhaps. Love. Jason Segel. I think he did an excellent job portraying David Foster Wallace. Having not known him before, I see a completely believable character who I greatly appreciated and want to read about and know more about. Something that I kind of wrote down is that he gave me I'm a big Andy Warhol fan, and he gave me like a more modern flavor of Andy Warhol with like this deep curiosity and like look at the culture and the mainstream and mass media and what it's doing to us and living in it and becoming it. And I really, really appreciated that aspect to him as a person. With him, it turned into this kind of like satirical, cynical, spiraling, can't live in this kind of world spin. With Warhol, it's put it up on a pedestal, make it art. It's just a more postmodern approach and result of thinking about it in that kind of way. So, like Kevin said, it made me really, really more curious about David Foster Wallace. So I think if that was maybe a goal of this movie, they accomplished that. I think another goal of this movie is the conversations surrounding fame, depression, mass media again, and what that does to an individual. Love kind of conversations like that. I love movies, as we've discussed before, that are very dialogue heavy. This one is, and I feel like it's all really valuable dialogue. I also like that, and everybody likes, it's a trope, a buddy film. This is kind of a buddy film in its own kind of way that's a little heavier, a little more real, but at the end of the day, it's these two personalities coming together, but set in real life with jobs to do. Everybody likes a buddy film. That's on the love list. On the don't like lists is what we already touched on. They don't ever really say what becomes of the whole project that we've been invested in for the 5-day interview. I wish that they just kind of tied a bow on what happened with that. I think that it would be so much more powerful if we knew that he didn't end up writing it in the end, because it's just kind of a necessary bow to tie. I don't like Jesse Eisenberg in this movie. I like him as a person, but I he's always him, and it takes me out of the movie. I couldn't ever feel like both of my feet were in this film because he's just being him. It also didn't blow my hair back. It's my other note. It's a good movie. I liked it. It made me think about things, but did it amaze me and make me fall out of my chair? No. And I think you got to be there to get to a top letter. I also, lastly, think that this is a movie to watch maybe by yourself or with. I watched it with Eric. I can watch it with Eric, but if I was like watching it with a group of friends, it would not be a fun time. And I think that movies that for me are really, really good, I can show to a whole group of people and we can all feel it together. And I just feel like this one is one that's like not a group watch kind of situation, which is fine. But for me, I'm putting that negates it a little bit. I'm rambling, but what I'm trying to say is I agree with Kevin that this for me also gets a solid B24.
All right, well, I pretty much agree with what everybody said here. In the end, this film is really just a character study of two different people. And the Jesse Eisenberg, David Lipsky character study falls flat to me compared to the David Foster Wallace character study. And I know it is about a journalist interviewing someone else, but like, it definitely was a lot about David Lipsky too, and the journalist's relationship to a subject. And so I'm definitely knocking it for that. Cinematography was, like I was saying, was good, and I actually think that they had kind of this 90s feel to the picture of the film, and I kind of like that. I definitely think that was a conscious choice. And Jason Segel's performance as David Foster Wallace, I actually enjoyed a lot too. When you combine that with the screenplay and all of... I'm thinking a lot of the lines here were kind of just given to them, but they had to make a conscious choice of, what to put in the film and what to not put in the film. And I think they put the right parts in the film to kind of describe this character to an audience, So in the end, I think I'm going to also give this a B24. I had that in my head before you guys gave it a B24, so I don't have anything more or less to add on to that.
Okay. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed this film. I think Kelly nailed it on the head in terms of this is a film that I would recommend to, people who are, big like literary nerds, to people that, have dealt with, mental health or want to better understand it. This is definitely not a film I would watch with, friends or family or, just hang out, let's throw a movie on. This is a film that I would probably watch by myself or with, my significant other or whatnot. I'm not the biggest, literary nerd, so I did not know David Foster Wallace. I thought his character was portrayed very well, but, obviously what stuck with me or resonated with me was, again, his anxiety and the imposter syndrome and how he expressed it and all that stuff really, again, resonated with me, and I really enjoyed that aspect. And there is stuff that I did not like. And it goes with Jesse Eisenberg. I mean, I've seen him play Lex Luthor, I've seen him play Mark Zuckerberg, and I've seen him play this guy, and they're all the same people. He's either fighting zombies, Superman, or interviewing David Foster Wallace. It's all the same person, right? So that's a bummer, a bummer on this film. But I think just the way it was written, and I'm a big proponent of the crisp, clean 90-minute films. And when I booted this thing up and it was almost 2 hours, I was like, oh, here we go. Let's fucking see what's going to happen here, boys. And I was enthralled. I was all about it. I don't think it deserves an A24. So I'm going to be on the B group with you guys. But I do think it deserves a B plus from me. So it's going to get a B plus 24 for me. Kevin, it looked like you had something you wanted to say towards the end.
No, you just reminded me that Jesse Eisenberg was the protagonist in Zombieland, and how the exact same effing thing.
Yep,
now I can't
all
think.
The same.
But picture him with a shotgun, saying double tap as he blasts a zombie away. Also, we never talked about this, but the gratuitous amount of smoking in this movie was ridiculous.
Very 90s, I think.
Right, yeah,
it's
but
the
it was
90s,
just
baby.
It was every scene, everywhere.
What did they say, like Brothers of the Lung, when they both have a
Yep.
cigarette for
Brothers
breakfast?
of a lung and
Hell
Pop
yeah.
Tarts and cigarettes for breakfast.
No.
Too good.
Chewing tobacco.
That's a
all
good
in-
point, Cole. This was a longer movie, but it did go by really fast for me as well.
Yeah.
Well, all in all, it seems like we all enjoyed this movie. Maybe not loved it, but thought it was a good film. And if you think this podcast is good and you love it, please give us a rating on Apple Music, Spotify, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. And if you hated this podcast, you can be silent. It's okay. We respect it.
Yeah.
We love you.
And,
Thank you.
Thanks,
and have
everybody.
a good night.
A few suggestions here if you're trying to watch a movie with the family that's A24. Hereditary, very good to watch with the family. X,
Hell yeah.
Men, The Lighthouse, also very good. Midsummer, fantastic film to watch with the family.
Classic.
So boot that
Classic
up with your
family.
6-year-old right next to you, and it'll be a good time.